Thank you very much. Now we are going to start a very exciting session because it's a policy roundtable talking about how the northern cities and regions can prepare for Brexit. So we have here Richard Corbett. He is an MEP. He's the leader of the Labour members of the European Parliament. He's part of the centre-left Socialists and Democrats group. He was first elected as an MEP in 1996, and Richard has represented Yorkshire and the Humber since 1999. We also have here Professor Anna Menon, the director of the UK Interchange in Europe, Katie Smuker, from the head of policy at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, where he leads the process of developing public policy ideas that are rooted in the Joseph Rowntree Foundation evidence base and the experience of people living in poverty. We have also Luke Rakes. This is a senior research fellow at the IPPR North, and he joined the think tank in 2013 and has published a wide range of highly influential research with a focus on the North. And we have Professor Philip McCann from the University of Sheffield. This roundtable is going to start. We have given already some directions of what we wanted them to talk about, but I think I'm going to start asking a question to all of them, just to introduce the debate, so maybe you can speak for 5-7 minutes, and then we can also take some questions from the audience, okay? So, Professor Anna Menon, to what extent has the EU referendum vote changed the political and institutional landscape of the UK?
Thanks, Raquel. This is the moment when you remember an email that Raquel sent you yesterday saying, this is what I'm going to ask you first, and then you remember that you haven't actually read it properly. But, I mean, there's a couple of things worth saying about what the Brexit vote has done to our country. Politically, it is reshaping our politics in pretty profound ways, because what Brexit has done is to add another division to the political landscape. If you think about it, our traditional political division was essentially between left and right. It was about ideas to do with the state, intervention in the economy, redistribution or no redistribution, the traditional stuff of politics. What the referendum has either accelerated or created, I tend towards accelerated, is a decoupling of class and politics. You see this in the election of 2017, where you see, and again in the recent local elections, where you see the Conservative vote share amongst working class people going up in a way that we haven't experienced virtually at all since the creation of the Labour Party. And in a sense, what's happening is that Brexit is a division not about left and right, it's a division about values. It's a division, broadly speaking, between social liberals and social authoritarians. I mean, there was that very famous study done by Professor Kaufman at Birkbeck who suggested that there's a correlation between how you voted in the Brexit referendum and what you think about the death penalty. It's culture politics. The Brexit referendum has introduced culture politics. And what that means, and it goes back to what I was saying this morning about this being a unique moment in our politics, we live in a world where Labour control Kensington and Canterbury, and where the Conservatives control Stoke South, and, you know, God help us, almost one in Wakefield. Okay, we live in a world that's a world I never thought I'd grow up to see. And what that means is, for the first time in my lifetime, neither big political party no longer knows exactly who it represents. Because in planning for the next election, Labour have to decide whether their first priority is to keep Kensington or whether it's to win back Mansfield. The Tories have similar sorts of choices ahead. So this reinforces my point from this morning that politically there is everything to play for in Britain at the moment in a way that simply wasn't the case under the old system. I mean, for me, there are positives to be taken from the Brexit referendum, and one of them is we're having meetings like this, talking about issues like this, that would never have been on the national political agenda had the shock of Brexit not affected it. Was that 3 minutes?
It was very good. It was very good. Thank you very much, Anand. So now we move to Richard Corbett, and I just want to think about our research somehow focus that the vote to leave might affect differently different parts of the UK. So thinking about this, many of the areas in the north which voted leave are parts of the UK which are the most dependent on the EU for their economic prosperity. So how can we best respond to their needs in a post-Brexit context?
That, at present, is a very difficult question to answer because there is so much that we don't yet know about Brexit, assuming it happens, will turn out to be. The headline this week, of course, last week, was the inability of the government, 2 years after the referendum nearly, to even define a starting point for the negotiations for our future customs arrangements with the European Union. But there are plenty of other things as well that we just don't know. And that makes planning difficult. We are a region here in Yorkshire and Humber that, for a start, is a manufacturing region. Whether our exporting manufacturers face a barrier to their main export market is a key question. We don't know exactly what sort of barriers are likely even at present. We are a region with the Humber estuary, our export highway to Europe. What is going to happen to the Humber ports if they are going to be encumbered with customs controls or checks, regulatory checks, because we diverge from single market rules? If we do, and to what degree? We simply don't know yet. We are a major agricultural region. What is going to happen to our farmers if we are no longer part of a single agricultural market with agreed levels of subsidy across Europe to have a level playing field? Those negotiations haven't even started. And that's not just about the farmers themselves. One example, most of the lamb in region is exported mostly to the rest of Europe. If that falls apart, it will be much loved landscapes that will be at threat, not just the farmers themselves that we all enjoy. Fishing is still important on our coastline. The dream that we might increase our share of the catch by excluding vessels from other countries from our waters, itself easier said than done, is actually a much smaller question economically than whether we will still be able to sell our fish. 80% of what we catch is exported, mostly to the European Union. We are a region with universities. What is going to happen to the European students that come here? There's already been a significant drop. What is going to happen to the Erasmus student exchange program? What is going to happen to university cooperation on research? We still don't know. Yet to plan for the future, you need to know those fundamentals. We are a region, certainly in this city of Leeds, Halifax and elsewhere, with a significant financial sector. Will our banks and insurance companies continue to be able to passport their services across the whole of the single market or not? That is still up for negotiation. It'll be okay for the transition period, but that's only an extra 21 months. We don't know. And that's why it's so hard for anybody to plan and respond to the consequences of Brexit. And I said at the beginning, assuming we go ahead with it. If I can just mention that point, I say this not so much because there was a campaign launched a couple of weeks ago to have a referendum on the actual deal once we know it, so that people can vote to confirm or not Brexit once you actually see what it's likely to entail. That campaign has had more success than I think it was anticipating when it was launched. But I'm saying it because of the parliamentary situation. When the government comes back with its deal for the meaningful vote in Parliament, it's quite clear already that the main opposition party, Labour, will vote against it because it won't meet the 6 tests that Labour has set. The Liberal Democrats, I'm sure, will do the same. The Scottish Nationalists, probably too. The Welsh Nationalists, the Green. It would need 20, only about possibly 14, but certainly 20 Conservatives to cross the floor for that deal to be defeated. Given the state of the civil war on Europe in the Conservative Party, which is still there, that's not inconceivable, especially if public opinion continues to do the opposite of what was expected, not rally behind the result, which we all thought. You know, people would say, well, we've had a debate, we've had a vote, let's get on with it. It's not gone that way. It's stayed more or less where it was. In fact, it's edged slightly further towards the Remain direction. If that continues, it's not impossible, because every time Brexit's in the news these days, it's in conjunction with cost, complication, complexity, problem that we never thought about before, problem that we were never told about before, government divisions, government incapacity to find a common position. You know, it's always bad news, isn't it? So that edging of public opinion in the opposite direction from what was anticipated may well cause the defeat of the Brexit deal when it comes back to Parliament. And then, what happens next? That will be the question. Doesn't mean leave without a bid deal. Nobody supports that. So it can only mean renegotiate or reconsider. Renegotiate for a different deal, if that's possible at all in the time available, or reconsider the whole question of Brexit as that campaign I mentioned earlier is demanding. This is not yet a settled issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now want to ask to Katie Smuker that thinking about the challenges and opportunities that Brexit might bring to the North, but in particular I want you to elaborate a bit more about the lower income type of families or people, and also those ones that are in a kind of more fragile working conditions. So if you can give us your impression about how Brexit will affect this group of people.
Okay, thank you. Well, before we even get to thinking about Brexit, I think it's worth just pausing to think about where we find ourselves right now. Mm-hmm. And where we find ourselves now is in a north of England where there are people locked out of opportunity. We're in a north of England where there are 3.4 million people experiencing poverty. And we're in a north of England where most of those people who are experiencing poverty are actually living in households where someone is in work. It's simply not acceptable that that is the state that we find ourselves in an economy where, you know, as a society, we think that work should be a route out of poverty, and we think that, you know, economic growth should bring better living standards for those who participate in it. So I think, you know, before we even begin to contemplate what the impact of Brexit might be, it's worth just pausing to think about where we're starting from. And we've heard quite a bit in the last session about the different sort of way in which customs deals and trade arrangements may impact on the UK in terms of the prices for the essential goods and services that we all rely on, and in terms of the strength of our economy and what that means for jobs. Now, I think it's worth just saying briefly that what happens to the prices of essential goods and services really, really matters for low-income people. It matters for all of us, but if you're in a low-income family, you spend a much greater proportion of your family budget on things like food, gas, electricity. £1 in every 6 of a low-income household goes on food. If food prices go up, those millions of people that I talked about who are already experiencing poverty in the north of England will find their budget stretched even further and find it even more difficult to make ends meet. We also know that whilst we have a problem with people who are in work yet in poverty in the UK and in the north of England in particular, employment is still the best route out of poverty. Mm-hmm. And so if the way in which we leave the European Union has an impact on employment levels overall, that too will have a very negative impact on poverty in the north of England. And it's something that JRF is currently doing some work on, looking at trying to extend some of the analysis that's already been done, looking at the impact of different deals and asking the question, well, what would that scenario mean for people who are on low income? So look out for that piece of work coming from us later in the year. Mm-hmm. But on a slightly more positive note, I did just want to say a couple of things about how the North can prepare for Brexit in a way that we think would actually mean that we would be doing what we can to ensure that we do have an economy that works for all. Firstly, we've heard a little bit earlier about the local industrial strategies that different parts of the North are beginning to, and the West Midlands as well, are beginning to develop. And I think there is a tendency in those strategies to think about the shiny and the new, to think about those kind of leading edge innovation frontier industries. They are going to be really important for growth. But I think if we're going to have businesses that are ready to deal with whatever is thrown at them by Brexit, we also need to be thinking about that long tail of firms that we have that are actually not at the frontier, those firms that are the lower productivity firms and sectors, and actually often the mass employing, low pay sectors such as retail and hospitality. We did some work recently that showed that in retail and hospitality, we managed to produce in 4 days what our European competitors produce in 5. Sorry, other way around. We produce in 5 what our European competitors produce in 4. And again, that's before we've even begun to deal with the impacts of Brexit. And so I think beginning to think about actually how those local industrial sectors local industrial strategies need to think about those sorts of businesses as well as just those that are at the leading edge. What does that mean for the business support that we provide at a local level will be really important. But we can't just think about the growth. We also need to think about who will be in a position to be able to benefit from that growth. We often talk about having a workforce that is prepared and ready for Brexit, but often that conversation turns very quickly to a conversation about school leavers and whether our school leavers are prepared for the world of work. Again, it's clearly a really important issue. But if you look at our labour market, 90% of the 2025 workforce has already left education. They're already in the workforce. So we need to be thinking really seriously about how we reskill people who are already in work. And actually, our readiness to do that is pretty dire. We don't have very good quality adult training and skills programs in place. We are seeing funding outside of apprenticeships being slashed very sharply since 2010, and the participation rate of adults in training and skills has been falling. The investment of employers in the training of their workforces has also been falling. We are not in a good place. And what we need to do is not only to think about what that skills system needs to look like in order to enable people to be ready for the world of work of the future, but actually we need to think about how that connects with that conversation about those growth sectors and where growth might come from. So not just which are the sectors that we think we need to invest in to make sure that they will grow, but how do we make sure that people have the skills that will enable them to access those jobs and share in that prosperity. And then one just final word I would like to say, which has already come up earlier, but I think is so important, is about the future of European structural funds. Those parts of the UK who are outside of the metropolitan centres of places like Manchester and Leeds have really been, as far as we have any kind of regional policy at the moment, those places are at the forefront of it. European structural funds have been a bit of a lifeline for those places that are outside of that. They have been supporting the endeavour to grow enterprise, to attract investment, to improve infrastructure, and also to ensure that people do have the employability and the skills to enable them to take up some of those jobs. There is a lot wrong that's wrong with European structural funds. Actually, there is an opportunity here to improve the way in which they operate in this country. But first, we have to secure the commitment to actually making sure that those funds are in place and are helping places that are currently left behind, those places that did vote for Brexit in large numbers, that the funding is there, it's secure, and that the policy that is developed will actually enable places not just to think about growth, but also to think about who benefits from that growth.
Thank you very much, Katie. So now I want to ask to look, as I mentioned before, IPPR North released a report on the state of the North, and part of the report also had a section on Brexit. So can you reflect on the main conclusions of that report, please?
Yeah, no problem. And some of you have got this on your tables. In fact, it's the State of the North 2017 report. And it actually looks at a number of things, not just Brexit. It looks into the 2020s and asks about the millennial generation that will inherit all of these difficulties, people aged under 37, under 38, who will now be moving into positions of leadership within business and in politics and so on, and who will have to, at the end of the day, be dealing with the problems that we're talking about here. But I suppose I'd step back and start to look actually at the northern economy in the first place. We've spent a number of years at IPPI North analysing the nature of the North's economy, and there's kind of a consensus of the sectors in which it specialises. Some of them have been referenced already, and that is the digital sector, the energy sector, health innovation, and advanced manufacturing. These are the frontier sectors that Katie was talking about. They're the big shiny sectors that you'll see big buildings devoted to them across the north. And they're distributed quite broadly across the north's geography. So we've got advanced manufacturing in Lancashire, we've got health innovation in Cheshire, and you've got energy on the coasts, for example. So they're not just in those major cities. And the discussion earlier alluded to agglomeration economies and the importance of cities and knowledge-intensive business services. Of course, those are important. But we must understand them in the context of the other sectors which the North is actually really good at. But then there's also some employment in those sectors like financial and professional services, in education and in logistics, for example. But actually most of the people in the North are employed in the sectors to which Katie referred. So we call this the everyday economy and everyday usage. So it's largely non-traded. So these are the people who work in retail and wholesale. We're paid about £326 a week. So that's 1 million people in the North employed in that sector. Accommodation and food service activities, about 500,000 people in the North employed in that sector. Weekly pay is just £195. So a lot of these sectors are already quite poorly paid and have poor working conditions. And it's important to note also that the North's economy is not particularly resilient. Some parts of it are. So places like Leeds and Greater Manchester are quite resilient. North Yorkshire is also quite resilient. But other places lack the kind of strength of labour force, an adaptive, highly skilled labour force, the strong governance, the financial flows and the business diversity that you need to adapt to a shock, such as Brexit. And so we've heard from some of the other people talking this evening that the North will be hit hard by Brexit because it's a trading region and because of the sort of cut that will come into those supply chains. But of course, as was spoken about earlier, that will have an impact further down the supply chain, so in those sorts of enabling capabilities in financial and professional services. So it will have a massive knock-on effect there, but it will have a further knock-on effect on that everyday economy where conditions are already poor, where people are already paid particularly badly. And so I suppose what I'd say is we need to do 3 different things. And one of them is to get the North's interests represented properly in national government. Now, the North's economy is unique, as I've just described. London is certainly having its say. Wales is having its say. Scotland is having its say. Certainly Northern Ireland is at the focus of much of this debate. But what about the North? What about the rest of England? England is, it's a huge country which is not really getting its say in a lot of this. And the Convention of the North is meeting next month. We would hope that Brexit will be one of its top priorities alongside things such as transport. But the second thing that we need to do, and this is also something which other people have spoken about, is these local industrial strategies which are being piloted across the country. We need them to be actually quite meaty and proper industrial strategies. And the reason I say that is our experience with industrial strategies or with local economic strategies has not been great in the past few years. So it looks like some places might just sort of rebadge their strategic economic plans, and those of you who've read those strategic economic plans will know they're quite a mixed bag. Some are very good, quite a lot are very poor. And if this is all that's done, is it's just rebadged as local industrial strategies, if it's just a science and innovation audit, here's a wish list of things we want to invest in, that's not really what's needed. We need something far more radical and a far bigger investment programme than was discussed. And also it needs to not just focus on those frontier industries, and like Katie would say, we need to actually be focusing on that everyday economy, on that long tail of low productivity sectors, on retail and hospitality, difficult sectors for industrial strategy to focus on, because we're not really used to asking the question, what could industrial strategy do for retail? But we need to be asking that question with a high degree of urgency. And the third thing that we would say at IPPI North is that we need to evolve that regional tier of government now more than ever. Other countries have a lot to teach us, especially Germany, and their adaptation to the sort of post-1990 when the Berlin Wall fell and East Germany being quite run down. Actually, most parts of East Germany are more productive than the North now. And there's been a massive programme of investment in East Germany over 20, 30 years in order to make that happen. How can we learn from that in the UK? Because we're about to face one heck of a shock to already run down economies. So we need a big programme of investment, and that actually needs to be delivered at a regional tier. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Luke. And now I think that I would like to finish with Philip, because in the previous session we have been introducing you to the research that we have been conducting on the regional analysis and the competitiveness analysis, but we haven't been covering all the part of our analysis that is about the regional governance. So I want to ask Phil, to what extent do you think that the institutional or governance failures contribute to the vote for Brexit? And how this has evolved.
Thank you, Raquel. I think I've been arguing this for quite a long time. Indeed, I published a book in 2016 before the Brexit vote, and it wasn't particularly about Brexit, although I did point out that it was a continuum of issues. And it's called the UK Regional National Economic Problem. It's almost 570 pages long. It's extremely dense in terms of data. But the reality of the UK economy over the last 30 years is the UK's economy is basically decoupling. To some extent, it's already decoupled. This is the language I use, and I'm very pleased to see now that many politicians across different parties and people in the civil service are using it. The UK economy is a very strange case. Angus Maddison, who developed the first national data sets of national economic performance through historical periods, used to say, when he was working in the 1970s and 1980s, he used to say there's four kinds of country in the world. There's rich countries, poor developing countries, Japan, and Argentina. His point being, you simply can't classify Japan in the 1970s or 80s with respect to anyone else. It doesn't look like anything else. And the same with Argentina. Japan in a good way, incredible growth and technology. Argentina going backwards for 70 years. I would say there's also the UK. I think today the UK is an absolute outlier in the global economy, and particularly amongst the industrialised world. And the argument is this. The UK economy has been decoupling for 30 years into basically three separate countries. There's a country which is London and its hinterland regions, parts of the east, southeast and southwest. Doesn't mean every part, but broadly those regions. There is Scotland, which has been slowly drifting away institutionally. And then there's the rump of the UK, which is all of the north, all of the Midlands, plus Wales and Northern Ireland. And over time, on almost every single economic indicator, trade flows, patent flows, corporate structures, inter-regional balance of payment structures, housing markets, labour markets, also public allocation of resources, government funding, transportation flows. It doesn't really matter how you define it, even heritage funding allocations. It doesn't really matter which indicator you use. You get the same result in almost everything, even using data on longevity, life cycles. So the result is that today, so around the time of the referendum, 47% of the population, so just almost half of the UK population, today live in localities whose productivity, which is the best measure of prosperity, whose productivity is no better than the poorer parts of the former East Germany. Think about that. 47%, almost half of the UK today, live in places whose prosperity is no better than the poorer parts, I'm not talking about Berlin, the poorer parts of the former East Germany. More than half the population of the UK live in places which are poorer than the US states of West Virginia and Mississippi. More than half the population of the UK live in places which are poorer than the US states of West Virginia and Mississippi. I remember watching a Channel 4 documentary prior to the last US presidential election, and they were going to these hick towns in West Virginia. You know, they look at these poor people, lost their jobs and mines, and they're all voting Trump. I'm thinking, why don't you go to Yorkshire, Lancashire, Nottinghamshire, Leicestershire, many parts of Warwickshire, most of Staffordshire, all of South Wales apart from Cardiff. Unbelievable. This is our reality, and our political classes, doesn't matter which party you're talking about, including journalists, think tank people, particularly journalists, have no idea about this. Today the UK is the 14th richest country in Europe. Think about that. The UK is the 14th richest country in Europe. If you take out the productivity premium of London, we're poorer than Italy. And at current growth rates, we'll be overtaken by Spain within 3 years. Think about it. The rest of the UK. What's happened is the UK is partitioned into 3 separate countries, and that partitioning is increasing. And London is the hyper-globalized part of the UK. It's super successful, but it doesn't represent the country. Most of the country's going in a different direction. So the extent to which the richer parts of the UK have outperformed European and OECD averages is almost exactly the same that the rest of the UK has underperformed international averages over the last 30 years. So in real terms, we've gone nowhere. The UK today is in aggregate productivity terms, in relative to our competitive countries, is exactly the same as it was in both 1991 and in 1971, when we were called the sick man of Europe. We've only overtaken one country in 50 years, and that country is New Zealand. And we've been overtaken by many since then. Why? Because our country is splitting, and half the country is falling back, and central government doesn't notice. And it's not party political. Central government does not know what to do. Why? Because we're hyper-centralized. And a hyper-centralized top-down state, which is what we call space-blind, it doesn't focus on regional geographical things in the way that the US does, or Germany, or Canada, or Australia. It's all central government. It's hyper-centralized, it's top-down. That kind of governance system works in a country which internally is very equal. New Zealand, Finland, the Netherlands, even a large country like Japan, internally, these countries are very equal. So when you have a national policy in anything, you have some sort of idea in your head about what that policy is supposed to achieve. You have a construct in your head of what your country looks like, or your regions. If they're all basically the same, they're just different in size, but they're basically the same on all socioeconomic indicators, then a centralized top-down system works. In the UK, we are the most unequal country internally of any industrialized country. Today, the variations in the UK are as big as the whole of the Eurozone. The whole of the Eurozone productivity variations are no bigger than the productivity variations within the UK. And we are the size of the US state of Wyoming. We're smaller than the state of Colorado. We're smaller than the US state of New York. Think about it. Why? But this is what's happened to our country. We have the worst governance and institutional setup imaginable given the realities of the country. It's not caused by that. The shocks to the economy have been driven by very complex changes in globalization. But we have no means at the moment with the current governance setup to do anything about it. When people vote, whether they vote leave or remain, people vote because they have profound views and feelings on what the future is, what the present is, and also what the past is. But what we do know from our work initially, and now from many, many other people's works which comes with the same finding, is the places that voted leave are the most vulnerable. Those inequalities will get bigger. I was asked by Evan Davis, sorry. Not Gavin, yeah. Evan Davis asked me in a public debate recently in London, do you think the interregional inequalities will get bigger post-Brexit? I said it took me 570 pages to explain. The answer is yes. What do we do about governance? It does not matter which government is in power, which political party, and it doesn't matter if you're pro-Brexit or pro-leave. The same question is there. What on earth do we do? And the transition from a hyper-centralized governance system, which has become more centralized precisely because of Brexit. Jonathan Portis from UK Changing Europe and Tony Travers were talking about this week in London. Most government functions have effectively stopped. There's a huge backup of legislation because the civil service is not able to cope, and politicians are simply unaware of the complexities. They don't know what to do. So what do we do in terms of trying to restructure, redesign our political and governance system, our institutional structures to best respond to these realities? That's the fundamental question for me, because those realities are going to get worse for precisely the places that voted for change. It's not that people were irrational in their voting. The issue was simply never discussed on either side in the campaign, other than the metropolitan elite argument. That the beneficiaries of Europe are basically the rich people in London. That is not true. In trade terms, it's the opposite. The major beneficiaries of European markets are places like Lincolnshire, Humberside, Cumbria, Nottinghamshire, Staffordshire. They're far more integrated in relative terms than the richer parts of the UK. But now, what do? We can't carry on just centralising it because government doesn't know what to do. Ministers don't know what to do. They don't have the faintest clue what to do. They don't have the resources or the means. They don't have the people. But neither do localities in the UK, apart from a small number of places, maybe Greater Manchester, West Midlands, Birmingham, possibly Leeds. They simply don't have the capacity. The LEPs of most of the local enterprise partnerships, for example, in most of our counties, shire counties, they've got one person working half a day a week. They have no data. They have no evidence. They have no way of monitoring, even if they design a policy. They have no way of evaluating it. It's little more than that. And that's not good enough for the realities we're going to face.
Well, thank you very much. Quite depressive. So I might maybe ask the panel if they want to react to the presentations of other panelists. So I don't know, maybe Richard, do you want to comment on what you have here?
Just to say on that shocking analysis that we've just heard from Philip. Philip, have you not heard from Boris Johnson and Liam Fox? We have a glorious future. As soon as we break these chains which shackle us to our failing neighbours, our nasty European neighbours, we will do well, we will do brilliantly. We'll have shiny new trade deals ready from day one that will reinvigorate the north and every region of the country. I presume you've not looked at that in your analysis.
Actually, we have, and we've published it. Again, I'm not a politician. I'm not interested in political language. I'm only interested in political language from an analytical point of view because it indicates directions of travel. But I'm not an expert in these things. What do we know? The argument about we live in a post-geographical world, that is not true. It's not by assumption that all the data, including the data we've just shown you, tells you that that is not true. The irony of the modern world, if you look at historical empire processes, the empire era of the 17th, 18th, early 19th and early 20th century, many trading relationships were very long distance. France with its colonial areas in Africa and southern Asia, Southeast Asia, the British with Australia, New Zealand, southern parts of Africa, India, the Dutch with the East Indies. The irony about modern communications is we can get around the world in a day. You can get to Sydney in a day, within less than a day easily, and yet the cost of distance, ironically, have increased. They've not fallen. Why? Because it's not about getting from A to B. It's about people's customer preferences. They want things faster and faster and faster. Everything wants to be fresh. Everything has to be customized. That's how we compete. In our economy, we compete using high value-added knowledge, and those things are intensely face-to-face dependent. And actually, there's a huge amount of data. There's lots and lots of data shows the closer you are, the more you interact. Because the cost of distance, strangely, we're not in a post-geographical world. We're in a world where geography is more critical than ever between countries and also within countries. This is precisely what we're talking about. The world is not flat. The world is more spiky than it's ever been on almost every social and economic indicator. The second one was the trade argument. This trade surplus stuff, it's nonsense. So two things. One, the trade balance argument is nonsense. Two, we're in a post-geographical world is also nonsense. And it's important to understand that these are nonsense because then at least we can start having a proper debate about what we're going to do about the governance challenges post-Brexit. And the trade deal issue, we've also published this using our data. The way to understand it, the European Union is the economy of the EU in the UK, the demand in the UK is basically half the size of the London economy. It's equivalent to 2/3 of the size of the economy of the southeast of England. And it is bigger than every other regional economy. So the total economy of Yorkshire and Humberside to the UK economy is smaller than the contribution of the European Union economy to the UK. That's how to think about it. These are big numbers. The case of China, it's a massive economy. The Chinese economy in the UK is approximately the size of the Newcastle economy. The Indian economy is something like the economy of Bournemouth. The Australian economies, the China economies, the Canadian economies, again, parts of Bournemouth. The New Zealand economy, we can have a trade deal in New Zealand, sounds great. It's like the equivalent of having 10 or 20% growth in Chesterfield or Mansfield. These are things which are symbolic, and symbolism, of course, is important in politics. But if you understand the numbers, a trade deal in New Zealand is like growing, a suburban neighbourhood in Nottingham.
Please, Annan.
I just want to go back to what Richard said, which kind of depresses me. The problem that Philip just spelt out to all of us, it's not a Brexit problem. It's a problem that's been caused to this country over years by politicians of both big parties. So simply to say, seen what Boris said, seems to me that old trick of saying, let's just blame the other side and carry on as normal. For me, the first thing that should have happened post-referendum would have been a generalised mea culpa from our whole political class for allowing a situation to come about where 52% of the population were willing to take a punt because they thought the status quo was no good whatsoever. A mea culpa from our whole political class of left and right for allowing the situation that Philip so eloquently described to have come about. Now, I'm not for a moment saying that Brexit makes any of this easier. It doesn't. It makes it a whole lot harder. But let's bear in mind that these are the problems stored up over years and years and years. And simply saying, oh, well, this is a Brexit thing, is wrong. This is a London politics thing. And basically, we keep going around in circles, but the answer has to be there are two sorts of answer. I was interested listening to Ali earlier on that she had, we should be in the customs union, we should be in the single market, we should have devolution. We should also have a government that cares. That would be a good first step. Having a government in Westminster that was willing to invest in the North would be a good first step. But secondly, I think there is no way round the fact that our country is so divided and Westminster has proven itself so abject that for at least three reasons we have to have greater devolution. We need greater devolution because actually it strikes me that no one is ever going to trust London government again. I mean, we've had the good rhetoric since the 80s when the pits were closed down about how we're going to make this all right. No one has done anything. I mean, they might have tossed a few goodies in the shape of working tax credits, but no one's done anything to make sure kids here have a future. That actually there is a way out of a lifestyle that communities get trapped into for younger people. All those things have not been dealt with at all. And secondly, there are Brexit-specific issues. There's a capacity issue, as Philip said. The central government can't do Brexit. It can't do anything else on top of Brexit. You can take that for granted, because nothing else will get done. And the third thing is, central government doesn't know what it's talking about half the time. Central government doesn't know local communities. It doesn't know different parts of the United Kingdom. I mean, one of the most interesting things of political debates over the last 3 or 4 years were the almost spitting image-esque reactions of politicians when you suggested that while the House of Commons was being decontaminated, they should shift to Rochdale. You'd have thought you'd ask them to go to Damascus. But that, for me, in a sense, was intellectually the last straw. We are their country too. And given the fact that for so long they've failed to appreciate or act on that, I think it is time that they start to give up some of the power and authority they have and give it to the regions that care for themselves.
Please, Richard.
I agree with most of what you said, so I'm sorry you began by trivialising my throwaway comment about Boris Johnson. I was not trying to make a party political point. I recognise that the divisions on Brexit transcend parties. I was trying to make the point that the challenges that had just been outlined, the problems facing our economy, there are some people going around saying they will all be solved by Brexit. Well, they damn well won't be solved by Brexit, and I think that's common ground on this platform. And I would confirm what I said before about that. It's not going to solve Brexit. The Brexit that is being delivered also bears no resemblance to to the claims that were made by the Leave campaign and by Tory Brexit ministers. That is also why I say that part of the solution to our future is, if we still can, seizing any opportunity to avoid this catastrophe. Don't rule it out. That doesn't mean we shouldn't discuss the rest of it.
Yes, please, come on.
No, Brexit won't make it easier to solve these problems. But if we hadn't had Brexit, we wouldn't be talking about them. It would be business as usual. That sort of identikit politician, think of a sort of photo that involves Nick Clegg, George Osborne, David Miliband, would be in charge of this country saying everything's fine because aggregate GDP is going up. You people be quiet, we'll give you some tax credits, and it'll be business as usual. The one thing that Brexit has done is say it can't be business as usual. I do not believe for a moment, without the referendum, the conversations we're having in this country now about intergenerational fairness, about geographical fairness, about the disparities between North and South, would be taking place in mainstream politics. It is a ridiculous way to have gone about it. There are easier ways to have dealt with these problems than to exit the European Union, but sadly our politics, it seems to me, have reached a point where there was no way of actually putting these things centre stage without a shock like this.
I think politics stopped being business as usual as soon as Jeremy Corbyn was elected leader of the Labour Party, which was before Brexit. Before Brexit. Whatever you think of Jeremy, that was a fundamental change.
Katie, do you want
Should we hear from the audience?
Yeah, I think so,
They've probably heard
because
enough from
this
us
is
for the
a
time being.
participatory workshop, but so now is your time. Chloe, can you please just take the microphone and just go around? So there is a gentleman there on the left.
I'm Peter Stark, I'm from Gateshead, and I'm the person who wrote the report on rebalancing our cultural capital, on the imbalance of funding in the arts and culture between London and the rest of the country. Sorry?
Could you hold the mic a bit nearer, please?
Yes, sure. My question is about the elephant in the room. Everybody so far today has talked about the need for devolution. Everybody has talked about a mixture of combined authorities, mayoralities, and then the word region has been used. Nobody's defined it. What does the panel see as the appropriate tier of governance to deal with devolution in the north of England? Do we return to the standard planning regions, or do we take the big leap and go for the north as a whole?
Do you want to take it, Luke?
Sure, that seems one that's up right up my street as someone who works on this quite a lot, and we've got a paper, in fact, coming out in the next couple of months, which will answer that question more comprehensively. I would say the building blocks for devolution should be the combined authority. There's legislation there that's established it, and that is one of the many functional economic areas there are in a country, but probably the one to start off with. But that leaves out a lot of the supply chains we discussed today and a lot of the other transport areas, the other policy areas such as transport, such as trade and investment and so on. And that there is therefore a need for a mezzanine tier or intermediate tier at the regional level. For a number of reasons, I would say that the north is the right one rather than the old northeast, northwest, Yorkshire and the Humber. In this globalised world, we need a scale that can actually register on the radar of the President of China, for example. Sometimes it's as simple as that. But also, we have the Transport for the North is already working at that geography, so it does make sense. And also, it means there's less duplication between the sub-region and the region. So in the Northwest, for example, if you have Greater Manchester Combined Authority, Liverpool City Region, what then does the Northwest do? Because that's most of its population and most of its economy. So yes, absolutely, we do need to talk about both. The fundamental building block should be the Combined Authority. Above that, the region. There are difficult questions, I suppose, in the south of England, which at IPPI North we don't often focus upon. And how do you divide the south into regions? That's the question we're coming to an answer on. But you do need both of those tiers of government to be much, much more powerful. And also, let's not forget, we need to reform the centre of government as well. That's perhaps, if anything, more important, particularly given the fact that at the moment, central government makes the funding decisions for local government, cutting many local authority budgets in half. So let's reflect on that. How on earth did that come about? That is not a healthy state of being. Perhaps things need to be tipped upside down. And again, sorry to go back to Germany, but things do work in a much more coherent way. There are transfers horizontally, vertically between regional authorities and so on. And also, via the second chamber, there is an accountability to regional government built into their constitution. So what can we learn from that? And it is large-scale reform that we need in response to Brexit. We can't sort of carry on down this route of tweaking around the edges. Actually, we need something a bit more substantial, I think.
Okay, so we have the gentleman. So, yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That's some fascinating stuff there, some really interesting facts and figures and some of the modelling. I've got some questions around the assumptions under those models, but it's not appropriate for today, and I'll go away and read the reports. Interesting, I think, in that the end of that panel discussion started to reflect the divisions of Brexit and people's views as opposed to focusing on the facts and figures. I don't believe facts are divorced from politics, but I just felt the discussion started to say, oh, we're doing this and we're doing that and that should happen and all the rest. But my question is, and I will be brief, what will we be able to do that we can't do before? We're not going to be shackled by Brexit, so what can we do? What are the opportunities? Does the panel have a view on those? Thank you.
Okay, this is a big question.
I'm Paul Stevens, EY and Department for International Trade. Thank you.
Okay, let me just take another question at the same time, and maybe we can combine two questions together. The lady here.
Hiya, I'm Helena from Durham University. I'm a PhD student looking at the impact of the EU on the northeast of England. My question is that we've been talking about the north, and we've seemed to have mainly focused on the sub-Pennine belt, Leeds, Manchester, Liverpool, and we haven't really discussed north of Leeds on the eastern side, especially with such like HS2, that's stopping at Leeds. So if we're going to have a regional area such as the north, how can we ensure that areas such as the northeast, which don't seem to be getting these infrastructural investments, does not get left behind, even though it is a part of the north powerhouse, to use the political term, but how can we ensure that it doesn't get left behind?
Okay, thank you very much. So maybe we can combine these two questions together. So we talk about the North in a more kind of general way, and so challenges, opportunities, and possibilities maybe. So maybe Katie, you want to comment on that?
I mean, I think I did touch on what I think is one of the opportunities of Brexit, which is that we will be repatriating those European structural funds. Now, like I said, they have played a really important role in sort of providing a lifeline to places that are currently left behind and somewhat left out of the national policy settlement. And I think when you look at if anyone here has ever had to actually try to administer or implement funding from those funds, and I can see a few heads nodding in the audience, and I also have some personal experience of this from a previous job. They are pretty hideous to try and administer. So I think there are some opportunities in areas like that where we can actually make those things work better and make them work for what we need in the UK. Because at the moment, you're eligible if you're below a certain level of EU GDP, and just about, or GVA should I say, and just about everywhere in the UK gets a bit. That's spreading a pretty small pot of money around quite a large number of areas. I think we can do a lot better if we're more targeted, if we're more focused, if we think long-term and flexibly about how we use that money to actually begin to join up, on the one hand, economic capital and growth, and on the other, human capital and people having the skills that they need to be able to access those jobs. There are, however, a lot of what-ifs in what I've just said. And the biggest one is actually securing the sort of £1 to £2 billion per year that actually goes into that funding pot at the moment. The government's committed to creating something called a shared prosperity fund, but we don't yet know how big that fund's going to be, what it's going to be used for, what the criteria are going to be. But I do think there is an opportunity in that. I also think that this conversation we've been having about devolution is an opportunity for us to think differently about how we deliver on some of this stuff. Because, we do need to try and bring those two sides of the economic growth and delivering for people in all places together. And devolution does offer us an opportunity to do that. But I think I would raise a kind of practical policy-making point that I think maybe we need to grapple with, which is that we are a long way from where we need to be able to actually deliver that in practice. We have some structures, like combined authorities, that would have the capacity and the legal status and the transparency and the accountability to be able to do that. We also have lots of local enterprise partnerships that I think Philip was saying, and is right to say, that a lot of them are really not up to the job, quite frankly. So to get from where we are now to where we need to be able to deliver this wonderful new devolved world of policy making in the amount of time that we have available whilst trying to negotiate Brexit, I think we probably need to be thinking about Plan B in the short term, about how we can actually deliver within the structures that we have, using those you know, how can we make LEPs as fit for purpose as they can be? How can we make sure that where we do have combined authorities, they are the ones who are in the lead? Because I think there are some really, you know, it's easy to see where we'd like to be. It's very challenging to see how we actually get there.
Thank you very much, Katie. Any other person wants to, Richard?
I would agree with that, but it depends crucially on having a government that really wants to address those issues. But can I come back to the same question, but a different aspect? The question of what can we do differently if we're outside the EU? The one that's most prominently in the debate still is the ability to do trade deals with third countries separately from the trade deals we currently have via the EU, and that is still trumpeted as something that will compensate for any loss of trade with the rest of Europe by having more trade with the rest of the world. The problem is that it's a little bit more complicated than you'd think, and unfortunately the devil is in the detail, and this therefore has not really, I think, got across in the public debate. Because if we leave not just the EU but the customs union as well, we have to negotiate new tariff agreements, trade agreements with countries across the globe to replace the ones we currently have negotiated as Europe, to do so in a hurry and simultaneously with many, many countries. The chances of us getting even the status quo, let alone a better deal, are actually quite small. The deals we have now are negotiated as EU with the clout of the world's largest market behind us. You'd get concessions, access to a third country's market in terms of their in exchange for their access to our market, when our market was the EU, the world's largest market. They would make concessions. They're not going to make the same concessions just for Britain. Certainly not in all cases. There are some countries that might say, yeah, fine, no problem, same deal as we have now. As soon as you agree to, I don't know, Argentina might say negotiations on the status of the Falkland Islands or other extraneous issues, we put ourselves in a vulnerable position. And having said all that, even rolling over the status quo doesn't work because of WTO rules of origin. Basically a deal, let's take the EU deal with South Korea. They can sell their cars in Europe, we can sell our cars there. What is our car? What is their car? Half the added value, 55% actually, has to be in South Korea to be classified as a Korean car, or in Europe to be classified as a European car. If we have exactly the same deal just as Britain, then that 55% of added value has to be made in Britain. There is not a single major car manufacturer in Britain that reaches that threshold of 55% because of supply chains going back and forth across our single European market. So even the status quo is actually a step backwards. And that is an issue that affects especially manufacturing regions, so especially the north, and I think it hasn't yet been adequately discussed.
Yeah, thank you very much for that comment. We had a very long discussion in Birmingham when we organized our workshop on West Midlands and the advanced manufacturing sectors. Mm-hmm. And many of the things that you have been talking now, they were discussed with experts on these subjects. And really, the reality is more complicated than it looks like, even in the newspapers and also in the politicians' speeches. So, Anand?
Phil's going to say something about the Northeast in a minute, so I'll leave that to him. But just on this opportunities thing, there's virtually nothing that Brexit in a practical sense allows us to do that we couldn't have done without it. I mean, Katie's spoken very sensibly about how we can anyone could design structural funds to be easier to use than the European Union has. So there are some not unimportant but perhaps marginal benefits. But when I say there's nothing we can do, that applies equally to if you're Liam Fox saying we'll be able to trade with China, look at German trade figures with China, you can trade with China from inside, or if you're Jeremy Corbyn saying look at what we can do if we're outside state aid rules, because there was nothing whatsoever in the last Labour manifesto that was illegal under EU rules. So it doesn't free us to do any of the things we said we were going to do anymore. So I come back to what I've been saying before, and it's not a panacea, but the opportunity comes from the fact that our politics has changed. The opportunity comes from the fact that the public is more mobilised now, I think. I mean, before the referendum in 2016, our big fear about politics was public apathy, public disengagement. There are signs that for the moment at least, that trend has been reversed. That, I think, is a very, very good thing, that people are more willing to get involved in politics, to vote, that in some political parties at least membership is going up. That is something we can take advantage of. And there have been some really weird, unexpected consequences of Brexit as well. Ali, when she was talking earlier, was talking about immigration. There was an absolutely fascinating piece in The Observer yesterday by my colleague Rob Ford, who has done a lot of survey work on this, showing that actually now that we've left the European Union, what is revealed are British public attitudes towards immigration that are actually remarkably liberal. And actually free of what many of those people, rightly or wrongly, saw as the shackles of free movement. We can have things like that sensible conversation about immigration and what a liberal immigration policy looks like. And it might be, however screwed up this is, it's easier to have that conversation post-Brexit, though you didn't need to have Brexit to have it, than it would have been for us for whatever reason beforehand.
Philip?
Yes, in terms of your question about the North East, the North East is a case where it comes back to the basic problem. So the infrastructure which connects, the main arterial infrastructures which connect our country by the standards of industrialized countries is basically very poor. I mean, in terms of, you know, the capacity, the volume and the size of our motorway infrastructure is one of the smallest in Europe. The size of our railway infrastructure is one of the smallest in Europe. So what it means is our infrastructure is always running at very, very high capacity levels, just a standard journey on the M6 or the M1. You go into a motorway, even in the Netherlands, which is a much more densely populated country, you never see traffic in Dutch motorways, apart from maybe at rush hour, or let's say the 2-hour rush hour, in and out of the Randstad. The Netherlands is a much more densely populated country than we are, but you just don't see the traffic. If you drive in Germany, you very rarely on German motorways, and German population densities are pretty much similar to the UK. You don't see the sheer quantity of traffic, particularly truck vehicles. Why is that? It's because our infrastructure is actually very small by the standards of industrialized countries. But we have a more fundamental problem. Because you could argue, well, that's good because you're using infrastructure extremely efficiently. You could argue that. The basic problem of our infrastructure is that it's monocentric. Our infrastructure pattern reflects our governance pattern.
Absolutely.
All of the infrastructure in the UK, both hard and soft, is utterly monocentric and hierarchical. Why? Well, there's historical reasons, the development of the different train companies in the 19th century, the Beeching reviews of the 1960s, whatever. But there's basically an incapacity to design a system which is designed for the real geography of our country. All of our infrastructure, whether it's hard or soft, whether it's roads or political capital, is all about trying to get access to London first. And because everyone's trying to get to London, no one gets proper access. You have a constant traffic jam. It's true if you try to get access to ministers. Unless you're Jaguar Land Rover, it's very hard to get access to a minister in the UK. Why? Because they've simply got too much on their plate. You know, and then we have a kind of a fancy dress party where ministers are being reshuffled. You know, is it going to make a big difference to anything? No, of course not, because they can't do anything. One, they don't know about the subject. Two, even if they do get really good advice, they don't have the power or the levers to do anything anyway. So we're always just playing at the margins. But where we make a fundamental decision, we do it the wrong way round. How should HS2 and HS3 be done? They should have built an integrated system in the Midlands and the North first without connecting it to London. You do the London connection last. Anyone here who's got advanced economic training will understand what's called the Krugman shadow effect. The worst thing you can do is London first. Why? Because you've always got the danger of it gets quicker to get from Birmingham to London. Great, we'll relocate stuff to London. It's the wrong way round. What you should have done is embedded all the cities and regions in the north, including the northeast, so that you get greater enmeshing of all those supply chains across all industries and sectors across the whole of the north of England, using better infrastructure systems like the Randstad, like the Ruhrgebiet in Germany, and you do the connection to London last. That's the economic argument. The problem is the political institutional argument is you have to do London first, and all the discussions about whether it's going to go this neighbourhood in London or that, where the stop exactly is going to relate to this particular London Underground metro stop or not, our political logic means we can only decentralise by London down. This is the very problem. Devolution should be bottom up, but our institutional systems, including our infrastructure systems, have simply no way to do it within the current setup. And the North East should have been part of it, but the whole thing should have been part of it before any of the other parts were done. And that is a metaphor for the problem of the whole governance of the UK. It's basically the same problem.
Well, thank you very much. So join me to thank all the panelists of this session today.